There is a world built on top of the bones of our own. A world where the grass grows over collapsed highways, where trees have pushed up through the cracked floors of shopping malls, where candy kingdoms rise over rivers of glowing nuclear waste, and vampire queens remember when the streets were full of people who looked like you and me. It is a world that is both absurd and devastating in equal measure, funny and heartbreaking in the same breath, packed with talking dogs and skeleton wizards and ancient cosmic entities, who all have to navigate the same fundamental questions about loneliness and love and what it means to be alive. That world is the Land of Ooo, and its story did not begin with Finn and Jake. It did not begin with Princess Bubblegum or Marceline or even the Ice King. That began millions of years before any of them drew breath, in the time of the dinosaurs, when a comet crossed the sky carrying something that had no name yet but already wanted everything to end. That is what we are getting into tonight. The full, complete, sprawling lore of Adventure Time. We are going back to the very beginning, before the beginning, to the moment a crown was forged in the Cretaceous and a wish went wrong in the worst possible way. And we are going to follow that thread all the way forward through the nuclear fire and the 1,000 years of wandering that followed. Through Simon and Marceline and Bonnibel and the Lich and Golb and everything in between. Until we reach the distant future where a small robotic being sits on a mountain throne and tells two young adventurers about the greatest heroes the Land of Ooo ever knew. Get comfortable. This is going to take a while, and it is worth every second. If you are watching this right now, drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are and what time it is there. There is something genuinely wonderful about knowing the story is being heard from so many different places at once. Hit subscribe if you have not already so you do not miss the next deep dive. Now, let us go back to the very beginning. Section 1. The World Before the World. Ancient Earth, the Elementals, and the Crown that started everything. The story of the Land of Ooo begins not in a candy-colored kingdom, not in a tree fort in the grasslands, and not even in the ruins of human civilization. It begins in the Cretaceous period. Roughly 65 million years before Finn ever picked up a sword, the Earth was a very different place. Large reptilian creatures dominated the landscape. The continents were still in the slow process of drifting toward configurations we would recognize. The sky was clear, for now. And in that ancient world, long before humans ever existed to complicate things, there were already elemental forces at work, shaping the planet, tending to its fundamental natures. Think about the scale of that. 65 million years. The human mind struggles to truly hold that number. It is the kind of time that makes recorded history feel like something that happened yesterday afternoon, a footnote in the deep calendar of the Earth's existence. The Roman Empire, and all of it, its rise and fall and the centuries it spent reshaping the Western world, fits into a single afternoon relative to the span of time we are discussing. The Egyptians built their pyramids at roughly 1/65th of a thousandth of the way through the period between Urgent's Evergreen's catastrophe and Finn's first adventure. When Adventure Time traces its mythology back to the Cretaceous, it is not doing so as a storytelling trick. It is staking a claim about what kind of show it is, a show that takes its fictional universe seriously enough to build it on deep time. On the idea that the things happening in the present are the consequences of processes that were set in motion so long ago that no one alive can fully comprehend the distance. Let that settle for a moment. You are comfortable where you are. The world outside is doing whatever it does. And somewhere in the deep past, an ice wizard was building a crown. And what he was doing was going to echo forward 65 million years to affect a boy in a white hat who had not been born yet. That is Adventure Time's cosmology. Everything is connected, and nothing is ever simply over. Adventure Time has a specific cosmology when it comes to elements, and understanding it matters enormously for everything that comes later. In this world, there are 4 fundamental elemental forces that exist not just as abstract concepts, but as living, thinking, feeling beings. There is the ice elemental, the fire elemental, the candy elemental, and the slime elemental. Each one is the living embodiment of their element, and each generation of these forces produces a new incarnation. They are not immortal in the traditional sense, but rather persistent, always finding new expression in new bodies across the millennia. The elementals we know from the main show, Princess Bubblegum as the candy elemental, Flame Princess as the fire elemental, Patience Saint Pim as the ice elemental, Slime Princess as the slime elemental, are only the most recent incarnations of something far, far older. Back in the Cretaceous, the ice elemental was a creature named Urgence Evergreen. And Urgence Evergreen was, by any measure, not a pleasant being. He was powerful, ancient, deeply intelligent, and utterly convinced that his own judgment was superior to everyone else's. He had a dinosaur companion, a devoted, gentle-hearted creature named Gunther, who served as his apprentice and who loved Evergreen with a sincerity that Evergreen never quite reciprocated. Gunther desperately wanted to learn magic. He idolized his master with the pure, uncomplicated devotion of someone who does not yet understand that their idol has fundamental character flaws. He wanted nothing more than to be like Evergreen. He practiced, he studied, he tried. Evergreen largely dismissed him. This is actually one of the most poignant relationships in Adventure Time's mythology, and it is easy to miss because it is presented almost as a prologue, an ancient backstory that explains a mechanism rather than introduces characters you are meant to care about. But Gunther is worth caring about. He is a dinosaur who loves someone who cannot love him back in the way he needs. And he is a being whose entire aspirational life is organized around becoming, like a person who sees him as useful at best and an inconvenience at worst. He practices magic in the hope that one day Evergreen will say, "That was well done, Gunther," and mean it. He carries himself with a specific kind of loyalty that belongs to people who have confused love with admiration and admiration with worthiness. Evergreen, on the other side of this dynamic, is not evil. He is not deliberately cruel. He is simply the kind of brilliant, powerful person who has never had to develop the emotional skills required to see the people around them clearly, because he has always been formidable enough that he did not need to. He has devoted himself to the stewardship of the ice elemental force, to understanding the deep mechanics of the world, not to the projects and purposes that consume him. Gunther is part of the furniture of his existence, useful, present, not fully seen. When we see them together, Evergreen commands, and Gunther obeys, and the dynamic has the specific texture of a relationship that both parties have settled into without quite choosing it. Evergreen talks to Gunther in the shorthand of someone who has stopped bothering to explain themselves, who assumes their reasoning is obvious. Gunther responds with the quick, eager compliance of someone who has stopped asking questions, because asking questions was sometimes met with irritation. It is a portrait of what happens when the power differential between two beings is large enough that genuine relationship becomes impossible. Right when one party cannot afford to be fully honest, and the other party has never noticed that honesty might be relevant. Urgence Evergreen discovered, through his observations of the sky, that something was coming. A comet. Not an ordinary comet, but a catalyst comet. The kind that hits the Earth every 1,000 years and brings with it an agent of change so profound that the world after is fundamentally different from the world before. This particular comet was green, and it carried within itself something that Evergreen recognized as pure destruction. Pure evil, in its most essential cosmic form. An entity without mercy, without empathy, without any capacity for anything except the desire to end life. The comet was the Lich, though it would not have that name for millions of years yet. Evergreen watched the sky and understood that if this comet struck the Earth, it would mean an extinction event. Not a minor one. A catastrophic reshaping of all life on the planet. And Urgence Evergreen, who was arrogant and self-important and cold in ways that went beyond his elemental nature, also genuinely did not want that to happen. He may have been difficult, he may have been cruel, but he was also, in his way, trying to save the world. His solution was the crown. He designed it himself, working with magic that touched the deep, phantasmal circuits of possibility, weaving a wish-granting mechanism into a physical object. The idea was elegant in theory. He would create a crown capable of granting its wearer their deepest wish, and he would wear it himself, and he would wish the comet out of existence. Simple. Direct. The kind of plan that makes complete sense as long as you are the one making it, and as long as nothing goes wrong. But Evergreen needed a power source for the crown. Specifically, he needed the ruby eyes of Magwood, a creature he referred to as a lava dog, a being of immense volcanic power, whose gems would provide the magical energy to make the crown's wish-granting mechanism function. Getting those rubies required confronting Magwood, which Evergreen did with his characteristic confidence and brutality, and eventually he obtained what he needed. The other elementals were not happy about this plan. Balthus the fire elemental, Chatsberry the candy elemental, Slimy D the slime elemental, Sashsue, they all had concerns. The crown was too powerful. Using it could cause irreparable damage to the fundamental structure of existence. So wish-granting device tied to someone's deepest desires was the kind of thing that could go wrong in ways that were difficult to predict. They tried to reason with Evergreen. Evergreen, in response, froze them. Just froze them solid where they stood, because he had decided he was right and did not have time to be argued with. This, with the benefit of hindsight, was not his best decision. While Evergreen was distracted dealing with the other elementals, while he was rushing to complete the crown before the comet arrived, he left Gunther alone with the nearly finished artifact. And here is where the tragic twist of Adventure Time's deep mythology reveals itself. Evergreen was incapacitated before he could put the crown on himself. The comet was approaching. Gunther was there. And with the single-minded logic of a devoted apprentice who wanted nothing more than to help his master, Gunther did the only thing he could think to do. He picked up the crown. He put it on his head. The crown was designed to grant the deepest wish of its wearer. Gunther's deepest wish, buried beneath his magical ambitions, and his dedication to Evergreen's cause was simpler than any of that. He wanted to be like his master. He wanted to be like Urgent's Evergreen. And so the crown granted that wish in the most literal, devastating way imaginable. It began to transform Gunther into a version of Evergreen. Not the real Evergreen, the Evergreen that Gunther perceived. The Evergreen who was always shooting ice magic and barking orders and treating the world like a problem to be solved through force. But the crown gave Gunther his heart's deepest desire, and his heart's deepest desire was to become a distorted mirror of the person he loved most. The comet struck the Earth. The extinction event happened. The comet that was the primordial lich crashed into the planet, and most life was wiped out. The age of the great dinosaurs ended, and the crown, having been worn and bonded to, carried within itself a kind of echo of Gunther's wish, a glitch in its coding, so that from that point forward, anyone who wore the crown would begin transforming into a version of Urgent's Evergreen. The wish-granting mechanism was warped. What should have been a tool for saving the world became a curse that would not fully manifest its consequences for millions of years. The rubies kept the crown's magic alive. The crown sat somewhere, waiting, preserved through geological time in ways that are never fully explained, but feel entirely consistent with Adventure Time's brand of magical logic. It passed through hands across the millennia. It would be found by a medieval Santa, by a Viking named Svein, by others whose stories are told only in glimpses. Each time someone put it on, the same thing began to happen. The same slow transformation. The same erosion. The same confused, fractured identity as the crown's circuitry tried to make whoever was wearing it into a pale copy of a dead ice wizard from the age of dinosaurs. But the most important person who ever found that crown would not find it until about 1,000 years before Finn and Jake lived in their tree fort. He would find it in Scandinavia. He would buy it from a dockworker, now probably thinking it was just an interesting antique. He would bring it home to show his fiancée. He would put it on his head to make her laugh. And that is where the next chapter of this story begins. Before we get there, though, we need to sit with what the Lich's Comet actually was, because understanding it matters for everything. The Purple Catalyst Comet, the one that appears near the end of the main series, tells Finn something important. It says it has been around forever and has embodied all that is good and all that is evil. When it says good, the camera looks at Finn. When it says evil, the Lich appears on screen. This is not metaphor. Finn and the Lich are, in a cosmic sense, mirror images of each other. They are both incarnations of Catalyst comets. Finn's comet was the agent of life and good, and arriving at around the time of the Mushroom War and eventually reincarnating into the hero who would stand against the darkness. The Lich's comet was the agent of destruction and death, arriving 65 million years ago to end the age of dinosaurs, and then lurking, dormant, waiting for the next opportunity. This is the cosmological spine of Adventure Time. Good and evil are not abstract moral categories here, but they are fundamental forces built into the structure of the universe, arriving on schedule every 1,000 years, playing out their eternal opposition in whatever forms the world needs them to take. And the Lich Yik, the embodiment of that green comet, would eventually become the most terrifying villain in a show full of extraordinary villains. Before any of that, though, there is the matter of Orgolorg. That's because the Cretaceous era is also when this particular thread begins. Orgolorg was a warlord. Not a human, not an elemental, but something older and stranger, a being of immense cosmic power who existed in the time before modern civilizations, who called himself the Breaker of Worlds, and who genuinely deserved the title. Orgolorg became aware of the catalyst comets and their power, and he had the ambition to intercept one and absorb its energy. Specifically, he aimed at a yellow comet, one of the comets associated with the rise of rational intelligence and the development of human civilization. The Martians, led by the cosmic being Abraham Lincoln, disapproved of this plan deeply. Grob Gob Glob Grod, the four-faced, four-bodied deity who served as a kind of divine guardian force, was dispatched to deal with Orgolorg. And deal with him they did. They defeated Orgolorg and cast him down to Earth, and Earth's gravity did something remarkable to an entity that had been used to operating on cosmic scales. It pressed him down, it compressed him, it crushed his vast cosmic form into something small and round and soft and entirely harmless. It turned Orgolorg, the Breaker of Worlds, into a penguin. A small, confused penguin who would spend thousands of years completely unaware of what he had once been, waddling around the various time periods of Adventure Time's world, eventually becoming the Ice King's beloved pet Gunter, and eventually, much, much later, being briefly reawakened to his true form when the next catalyst comet came around. This is the kind of narrative economy Adventure Time operates at, and the Lich's origins and Orgolorg's fate and the Ice King's penguin companion are all threads of the same story, and they were woven together before humans existed. The Earth now has a comet's worth of destructive evil dormant within its geology. It has a compressed cosmic warlord wandering its surface in penguin form. It has a crown with a glitched, wish-granting mechanism sitting somewhere in the world, waiting to be found. And it has millions of years ahead of it before all of these things will come together in a single catastrophic moment. First, humans have to appear, and rise, and build everything, and then destroy it. Section 2. The Great Mushroom War. The end of the world we knew. The war has no official start date in Adventure Time's timeline. The show is deliberately, thoughtfully vague about its specifics in ways that feel more haunting than any explicit account could manage. What we know is that it happened. What we know is that it was nuclear. What we know is that it ended the world as it was and began the process of creating the world as Finn and Jake would know it, 1,000 years later. Let's set the scene. Before the war, the world was ours. A modern civilization, recognizable in its broad outlines, full of the things that a world full of humans tends to fill itself with. Cities, roads, technology, shopping malls and cars and fast food restaurants, and VHS tapes and movies about how the world might end. People living their lives, falling in love, making plans, arguing about politics, having children, growing old. A world that hummed along with all the particular noise of intelligent, technological life going about its business. Simon Petrikov was part of this world. So was Marceline, though she was not quite human. So was a young Bonnabelle Bubblegum, still in her most essential form, still part of something vast and undifferentiated, not yet the princess she would become. All of them were there in the same world before everything changed. The opening sequence of Adventure Time, the brief pan across the landscape of Ooo that plays before every episode, contains, if you look carefully, the evidence of what used to be there. A rusted car buried in a hillside, almost consumed by the earth and the grass. The shape of a building that is now a natural landmark, its walls collapsed into geological features. Objects that are ancient artifacts in the world of Finn and Jake were just ordinary things 1,000 years earlier. Ordinary enough that people left them in the ground when they fled. Ordinary enough that no one bothered to carry them to safety because there would be more where those came from. There would not be more. There was not more. The world ended, and those objects stayed where they were, and the grass grew over them, and the magic saturated into the soil and began transforming everything in ways that made even the remnants strange. The Mushroom War is never shown directly in Adventure Time. We only see it in fragments. In Simon's video diary, shot through a window, showing a plane in the sky that might be a bomber. In the Flash of Farmworld's version of events, where the bomb is depicted as a greenish explosion that reaches up and out and changes the color of the sky. In the ruins that Marceline and her mother walk through in the Obsidian Special, still smoking, still radiating heat, the buildings collapsed into shapes that have no names, because no language has a word for what a building becomes after a nuclear strike reshapes it. We see the aftermath over and over. We never see the moment. This is deliberate. The show's creator has spoken about wanting to hint at the darkness rather than wallow in it, about recognizing that a children's cartoon could carry enormous weight without ever depicting the actual horror directly. The bombs are the backstory, not the story. The story is what grew from the rubble. But the rubble needed to be there, present in the background, felt rather than seen, and so that everything beautiful and strange and magical about Ooo would carry the awareness of what it was built on top of. The Candy Mountains and the grasslands and the Ice Kingdom all exist in the space that used to be occupied by a world that functioned the way our world functions, and they exist there because that world is gone. That weight makes them matter more, not less. That is Adventure Time's bargain with its audience. I will show you wonder, but I will not let you forget that wonder sometimes grows from devastation. The Mushroom War also, and this is worth sitting with, produced an entirely new biological order. The ambient magic that flooded the world after the war did not simply add sparkle to an otherwise unchanged ecosystem. It fundamentally rewrote what was biologically possible. The creatures of Ooo are not what they were before. The candy people are not simply candy. They are a new form of life that did not exist before the mother gum absorbed enough magic to begin generating consciousness. The talking animals are not simply clever. They evolved into sapient beings under the influence of a world where magic had become a real physical force, as real as gravity and radiation. The various kingdoms and principalities of Ooo represent not just political structures, but entirely new species establishing themselves in the ecological niches left vacant by the near extinction of the old world's biodiversity. Ooo is genuinely alien to the world that preceded it, and the 1,000 years between the bombs and the start of the show are the story of this new world finding its shape. The name Mushroom War tells us everything we need to know about the method of destruction. Mushroom clouds, nuclear weapons, a global exchange of atomic fire that transformed the geography of the planet, irradiated vast stretches of land, and destroyed the infrastructure of human civilization in ways that would not be recovered from, not in any form the original builders would recognize. The show leaves the specific political cause ambiguous, and that ambiguity is intentional. It does not matter which nation started it or why. What matters is that humans had built weapons capable of ending their own world, and then they used them. The physical transformation of the Earth was staggering. Coastlines changed, continents shifted from the force of repeated nuclear detonations. The landmarks of modern civilization, the buildings and bridges and highways, were shattered or buried or transformed beyond recognition. In the opening sequence of Adventure Time, if you watch carefully, you can see the remnants of that world peeking through the brightness of Ooo. A rusted car buried in a hillside. The ruins of a building collapsed under centuries of vines. Objects that were once mundane and are now ancient artifacts. The world of Finn and Jake is not a fantasy world that just happens to exist. It is our world, 1,000 years after we broke it. But the physical destruction, catastrophic as it was not the most significant thing the Mushroom War produced. The most significant thing was the bomb. Not the nuclear weapons in general, but one specific weapon. The mushroom bomb. A device so particular in its design and so profound in its consequences that it deserves its own examination. The mushroom bomb was different from the other nuclear weapons. It was mutagenic, designed not just to kill, but to transform. When it detonated, it released not just heat and radiation, but something else. Something that Adventure Time has never precisely defined, but which functions like concentrated primordial chaos, like the essence of the lich given physical expression through chemistry and nuclear physics. The blast created a crater. It left behind green, glowing waste. And from that waste, from that particular combination of nuclear energy and something ancient and terrible that had been dormant in the planet for 65 million years, the lich rose. Think about what that means. But the lich's essence had been part of the Earth since the Cretaceous comet struck. It had been dormant in the geological record, in whatever strange way cosmic evil persists through material form, waiting. The mushroom bomb did not create the lich. It released him. It gave the ancient evil a body, a physical form, a vessel in which to manifest in the modern world. A person was submerged in the mutagenic waste of the mushroom bomb's blast, and whatever remained of them was possessed by something far older and far colder than human evil. And the lich stood up from the rubble of the world that had destroyed itself, and he looked at the devastation around him, and he found it insufficient. He had wanted far more of this. He had wanted all of it. Now, most of humanity died. This needs to be said clearly and sat with for a moment, not because Adventure Time treats it with a casualness that sometimes obscures how enormous a tragedy it represents. The Mushroom War essentially ended human civilization. Millions, probably billions, of people were killed. The survivors were scattered, disoriented, living in the ruins of everything their species had built. Many died in the immediate aftermath of radiation exposure. Many more died in the climate disruption that followed, the nuclear winter effect, the agricultural collapse, the breakdown of all the social systems that keep large populations alive. Marceline's mother, Elise, is one of the glimpses we get of this aftermath. In the Obsidian Special, we see her trying to find a fallout shelter in the chaos of the post-war world, desperately searching through ruins that are still smoking, trying to keep her young daughter safe. Elise was human. She survived the initial blast, but she was sick. Radiation poisoning, most likely, moving through her body with the slow, relentless certainty of something there is no undoing. When Marceline finally found the shelter Elise had been looking for, she found its doors open and its inhabitants gone to bone. There was no safety left in the world. There was only survival, in whatever form it took. What happened to magic in all of this? Because the Land of Ooo is a magical place full of sorcery and enchantment, and the world that existed before the Mushroom War had essentially none of that. The show's creator, Pendleton Ward, described the setting as existing after the bombs have fallen and magic has come back into the world. The implication is that magic was always present in the deep structure of the universe, always a potential, but suppressed by something. The Mushroom War and its aftermath, particularly the detonation of the mushroom bomb and whatever that released, allowed magic to flood back into the world. The mutagenic waste that the lich rose from was not just nuclear radiation. It was radiation mixed with something magical, something that rewrote the biological possibilities of the creatures that survived, that allowed new life forms to emerge, that slowly transformed the ruined world into a place where candy can be sentient and rainbows can be alive and the dead can walk and sing. Over decades, then centuries, the Land of Ooo began to take shape from the wreckage. Not all at once, not cleanly. The process was slow and strange and full of individual stories that are only told in glimpses. New creatures appeared, mutated offspring of animals that had survived the war, transformed by the ambient magic of the post-war world into beings that were more than their ancestors. Humans who survived in scattered tribes found themselves in a changed world and changed themselves to survive in it. Some groups migrated. The human refugees known as Two Bread Tom's tribe sailed away from what remained of the mainland, detecting the abnormal atmospheric readings that spoke of ongoing environmental catastrophe, and they found a series of islands far out to sea. They would settle there and live in deliberate isolation for the next 1,000 years. And in the ruins of the cities, in the craters and the burned districts, and the collapsed suburban landscapes, other life found its foothold, a massive blob of pink bubblegum material. What would come to be known as the mother gum spread across what had once been a city and began its slow growth toward sentience. Small creatures built burrows in the rubble. The first mushroom people, the first candy life, the first of the extraordinary variety of beings that would eventually populate Ooo, were beginning their slow emergence from the catastrophe. One man walked through all of this, carrying a crown that was eating his mind from the inside. His name was Simon Petrikov. Section 3, Simon and Marceline, a father figure at the end of the world. Simon Petrikov did not intend to survive the Mushroom War. That is, he had no particular plan to outlive the apocalypse. He had no bunker prepared, no survival kit stocked, no contingency for the end of civilization. He had a crown. A crown he had bought from a dock worker in Scandinavia sometime before the bombs fell. A strange jeweled artifact that he had brought home to show his fiancée Betty, had placed on his head to make her laugh, and which had immediately and catastrophically begun rewriting who he was. Before the crown, Simon Petrikov was a particular kind of person. An antiquarian, a scholar of ancient artifacts, someone who spent his professional life hunting for objects that bridge the gap between the mundane and the mysterious. He was gentle in temperament, intellectually curious in the way that truly joyful scholars are, the kind of person who genuinely delights in the act of knowing things. He wore glasses. He had dark hair and olive skin. He was engaged to a woman named Betty Groff, at whom he called my princess, and his feeling for her was the kind of feeling that makes a person want to do small, ridiculous, tender things, like put on an old crown just to see her laugh. Simon had spent years of his academic career being quietly laughed at. He believed in magical artifacts in a world that did not believe in magic at all, and the professional reception to his research reflected that disbelief. He was the scholar who presented papers at conferences to rooms of politely skeptical colleagues who did not quite roll their eyes while he was looking. He kept going. He believed in what he was looking for with the persistence of someone who knows they are right and has decided to wait out the laughter. And in the end, he was right. The artifacts he spent his career pursuing were real, and the magic he believed in was real. And the proof of that was the crown he bought from a dock worker in Scandinavia, which was real in ways that exceeded any theory he had published and destroyed his life in the process. The fact that Simon was right about magic and magic destroyed him anyway is one of Adventure Time's more precise ironies. He had given his professional life to the pursuit of something real. He had found it. And what he found was a piece of the deep history of the world, the legacy of an ice elemental from the age of dinosaurs. A glitched wish-granting mechanism that had passed through centuries and continents before landing in a dockworker's collection, and then in Simon's hands. He had found exactly what he was looking for. He just had no way to know what it would cost him to hold it. The crown had other ideas. When Simon put it on, the crown's ancient, glitched circuitry activated immediately. It recognized a new wearer. It began the process it had always begun, reaching into the deepest layers of Simon's mind, looking for his truest wish, preparing to warp him in the direction of Urgent's Evergreen, the ice wizard whose imprint was baked into its fundamental design. Simon blacked out. When he came back to himself, he had done something he could not remember, something bad enough that Betty was frightened of him. He had no memory of what had happened. He only knew she left, and she did not come back. He began recording himself on VHS tapes. This is one of the most devastating details in all of Adventure Time's mythology. Simon Petrikov, knowing that his mind was failing him, knowing that the crown was taking him apart piece by piece, sat down in front of a camera and recorded what he needed someone to know. He documented his descent as clearly as he could while clarity was still available to him. He talked about Betty. He talked about the crown. He talked about what it was doing to him, the voices, the visions, the blackouts, the way his skin was slowly turning blue, the way his body temperature was dropping. He talked about hoping that Betty would find these tapes and understand what had happened to him and maybe forgive him. Nobody found those tapes for about 1,000 years. When Finn and Jake discovered them in the Ice King's castle, they watched a man explain his own destruction with the quiet dignity of someone who had already accepted that he was losing. It is one of the moments that Adventure Time uses to remind viewers that under all the candy-colored absurdity, the show is about real grief. The crown's magic kept Simon alive through the Mushroom War. This is important to understand. It was the crown's power, not his own survival instincts, that preserved him as the bombs fell. The crown made him survivable in conditions that would have killed an ordinary human. The irony of this protection is searing. The thing that was destroying his mind was also the only thing keeping his body intact. Simon owed his life to the instrument of his destruction. He had no choice but to keep wearing it. In the years immediately following the war, Simon wandered the ruined landscape. His mind was fragmenting. There were stretches of time where he was more Simon than Ice King, and stretches where the ice magic surged and the persona that the crown was building for him pushed through and took the controls. He was fighting a battle that no one else could see, against an enemy that was inside his own head. And he was losing it gradually, the way you lose a fight when you are already tired, and the other side is not. This is when he found her. Marceline Abadir was a child in the ruins of the world. Her father, Hunson Abadir, the immortal lord of evil and ruler of the Nightosphere dimension, was elsewhere or unavailable or simply not interested in being present for his daughter's survival. Her mother, Elise, was gone or dying or already dead. Marceline was alone in a devastated cityscape, sitting in the wreckage, small and frightened and entirely unequipped to navigate the end of civilization by herself. And Simon found her crying. He did not hesitate. He went to a destroyed toy shop nearby, picked through the rubble, and found something intact. A stuffed toy, a small, somewhat battered rag doll. He brought it to Marceline. She would later know this toy as Hambo, and it would be her most precious possession for centuries, lost and found and lost again, in ways that each carry their own particular emotional weight. What followed was not a simple rescue. It was not a man briefly helping a child and moving on. Simon Petrikov, who was already in the process of ceasing to be Simon Petrikov, became Marceline's guardian, her companion, her anchor to the idea that the world still contained something worth trusting. They traveled together through the ruins of cities that were still smoking. They found food in the wreckage of supermarkets, and they sheltered in buildings that were still standing. Simon did magic tricks to make Marceline laugh when she was scared, and he used the crown's ice powers when they needed to fight something in the dark. And he wrote her songs, and he told her stories, and he kept putting himself between her and everything that wanted to hurt her. The episode Simon and Marcy shows us this period in heartbreaking detail. It is the Snow Golem episode in structure, but in emotional content it is something else entirely. We see Simon carrying Marceline through a landscape of burnt orange devastation, searching for chicken soup because she is sick, finding a convenience store, fighting off the monstrous mutated creatures that have already begun filling the ecological niches left empty by the death of normal animals. Now we see Simon use the crown because he has to protect Marceline, and we see the light go out of him a little each time he does it. He sings to her, he makes her laugh. He is magnificent in the ways that matter, and falling apart in ways that will eventually be total. He left notes for her. The episode I Remember You reveals one of these notes, a photograph of Marceline as a child with a handwritten message on the back. Simon wrote that he did not know how much longer he would remember her, that he was losing the thread of himself, that whatever he did when he was no longer himself, whatever the crown made him do, he was sorry for it in advance. He told her that she needed to forgive him, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because she deserved the peace of having given it. That photograph would become a song, centuries later, when Marceline, who was by then the vampire queen of the Land of Ooo, sat with the creature who had been Simon Petrikov and played music with him. He did not remember her. He called himself the Ice King. He had been calling himself the Ice King for a very long time. The episode I Remember You is one of the most emotionally devastating half hours in children's television history. And if you have not seen it, please understand that that description is not hyperbole. But before the final severance, before Simon became lost entirely, there was one more act. He understood that the crown was going to take him. He understood that the Simon who loved Marceline, who remembered her name and her laugh and the sound she made when she was falling asleep, was not going to survive much longer. And he made a choice. Yet he would not stay and hurt her in his confusion. would not expose her to whatever the crown was turning him into, would not let her watch the last pieces of him fall away. He would leave. He would go, while enough of him remained to choose to go so that she did not have to watch it happen. Before he left, he summoned her father. He called Hunsen Abadir out of the nightosphere and asked him to watch over Marceline. It was the best he could do. It was not enough, but it was the best he could do. Marceline watched him ride away on a sled. She ran after him. She cried. And then she was alone again. Except now she had a father who ate her fries and could not be bothered to understand why that hurt, and a stubborn, breaking heart that would carry the shape of Simon Petrikov's absence for the next 1,000 years. The Ice King began his long, frozen, confused reign in the mountains. He built his kingdom of ice. He acquired penguins as companions, including, without knowing it, the ancient cosmic warlord Orgalorg, still compressed into the form of a small, waddling bird. He forgot Betty. He forgot his own name for stretches. He became, most of the time, not Semen Petrikov at all, but a pastiche of Urgence Evergreen, wearing his obsession with princesses as a way of reaching for the thing the crown had taken from him. The word princess was the last word he had ever called Betty, and it echoed through his fractured mind in a way he could not understand or articulate. He kidnapped princesses because he needed his princess, and he no longer remembered who his princess was. Section 4. The birth of Bubblegum and the founding of the Candy Kingdom. While Simon was losing his mind in slow motion, and Marceline was trying to survive in a world that had no particular investment in her survival, something else was happening in what had once been a city. Something was growing. The mother gum had no consciousness in the beginning. It was a vast quantity of bubblegum material, possibly the remnant of some industrial facility, possibly something transformed by the ambient magic of the post-war world, spreading slowly across the debris of collapsed buildings and irradiated streets. It existed as a kind of proto-mind, a hive awareness that processed information without quite thinking about it. Over the decades following the Mushroom War, as the magic of the New World soaked into it more deeply, the mother gum began to develop something more complex. Individual intelligences began to separate from the whole. Distinct personalities formed at the edges of the main biomass. Two of these personalities became fully independent. They separated from the mother gum entirely, grew into their own shapes, developed their own continuous thoughts and memories. One of them was a creature that would come to be known as Nettie. One of them was a young woman who would come to be known as Bonnabelle Bubblegum. Nettie's separation from the mother gum was traumatic in the most physical sense. He landed hard, on something sharp, and the shock of it was overwhelming. The world outside the mother gum was vast and loud and full of edges, and Nettie had not been prepared for any of it. He was not built for it. Not in whatever way individual beings are built for the world they emerge into. He retreated from everything he encountered. Loud noises sent him into panic. Strange creatures terrified him. The post-war landscape, full of weird mutant animals, and ambient magical energy, and the general chaos of a world rebuilding itself from nothing, was not a gentle environment for a profoundly sensitive being. Bonnabelle found a large tree, its roots deep and strong, and she guided Nettie to it. He pressed himself against those roots, began absorbing nutrients through them, began producing from himself a sweet, healing liquid that flowed back through the root system. He found a kind of peace there. He was safe. He could hide. He could provide. Bonnabelle, watching him settle into this new existence, and understood something about her brother that she would carry for the rest of her very long life. Some people are simply built different, and what they need is not to be pushed into functioning in ways that do not suit them, but to be protected and respected in the forms that actually work for them. She built around him, literally. She built the Candy Kingdom around Nettie's tree, ensuring that he was always hidden, always safe, always have the space he needed. The Candy Castle stands on top of the tree that Nettie lives inside. The juice he produces powers the kingdom, flowing through pipes and infrastructure in ways that only Princess Bubblegum fully understands. Nettie is not just a secret. He is the literal heartbeat of the Candy Kingdom's power infrastructure. And protecting him, giving him a world where he can exist without pain, that was Bonnabelle's first and most fundamental act of governance. But Bonnabelle was lonely. In the years before the Candy Kingdom was built, it was just her and Nettie in the rubble, and Nettie did not talk much. She had books, things salvaged from the ruins of the old world, and she read everything she could find. She understood chemistry and biology and physics in the way that someone who has read all the science books in a ruined library understands those things, which is to say, imperfectly but with tremendous breadth. She wanted family. She wanted the specific warmth of people who were designed to fit together with you. And so she made some. She built a machine from salvaged parts and created, from her own gum, three beings: Uncle Gumbald, Aunt Lolly, and Cousin Cheekly. She had found a photograph of a family in the ruins somewhere, and a real human family, and she had used their image as a template for her manufactured relatives, wanting to recreate the feeling of what she saw in that image. She gave them personalities, specific and complementary ones. She meant for them to be her family. Gumbald almost immediately had other ideas. Uncle Gumbald was clever, and clever in a particular way. The kind of clever that immediately begins calculating how any situation can be bent to serve its own interests. He saw the raw material of the post-war world, the empty space, the available resources, the fact that his niece was powerful and intelligent and had no real competition for territory. He proposed building a city. A candy city, larger than what Bonnibel had envisioned, more ambitious, more oriented toward his own vision of what power should look like. And he called it Gumbaldia, and he had layouts drawn up, and he began making plans. Bonnibel was cautious. She was young, still, in her reckoning of herself, and Gumbald was her uncle, and she did not want to distrust him. But she listened more carefully than he thought she was listening. And what she heard, in the conversations he had with Lolly and Cheekly when he thought she was not paying attention, was a plan to use a substance Gumbald had developed, he called it dum-dum juice, to make her more docile, more manageable, more willing to simply agree to his plans rather than questioning them. He had already dosed Lolly and Cheekly with it, in cupcakes, turning them into simple candy people with no memory of their previous selves. He was going to do the same to Bonnibel. She found out. She confronted him. And in the moment when Gumbald raised the beaker of dum-dum juice to force it on her, something happened that was equal parts accident and instinct. The beaker shattered, the juice splashed back, and Gumbald transformed into a talking bowl of fruit punch. His plans, his schemes, his ambitions, all of it dissolved into the simple, good-natured personality of a candy person who had no idea he had ever been anything else. Bonnibel looked at the three transformed people before her. She looked at how happy they seemed. And she made a decision that says a great deal about who she was and who she would become. She decided to let them stay that way. It was kinder, perhaps. It was certainly safer. It was also, if you turn it over and look at its underside, something more complicated than either of those things. That she liked having people around her who would not threaten her. She liked having subjects who would not plot. The same intelligence and will that Gumbald had tried to neutralize in her, she had used to neutralize him first. And then she had looked at the result and found it acceptable. She called herself Princess after that. Gumbald had used the word as a mild condescension, a way of marking her as young and unimportant, and ultimately controllable. She took it and made it her title. She would always be the princess, even when there was no obvious need for a princess, even when she was clearly the most powerful political entity in the entire Land of Ooo. The word became armor and identity in equal measure. The Candy Kingdom grew. Bonnibel built candy people to populate it, carefully managing their intelligence levels, never quite forgetting what had happened when she had created someone smart enough to want more than she was willing to give. She created the Gumball Guardians to defend her borders. She built the infrastructure, the pipes that carried Nettie's juice, the castle, the walls. She recruited Lady Rainicorn as a companion and advisor. She developed science and medicine and engineering and everything else that a functioning civilization requires. She was, in many ways, extraordinary, a child of the apocalypse who had turned catastrophe into something genuinely beautiful. She was also someone whose first major act of governance had been to chemically lobotomize an inconvenient family member and decide this was fine. This duality, the genuine brilliance and the cold pragmatism, that's the love for her people and the willingness to control them in ways they would never consent to if they understood what was happening. is the defining tension of Princess Bubblegum's entire thousand-year reign. She is not a villain. She is also not simply a hero. She is someone who loves what she has built and will do almost anything to protect it, and who sometimes cannot tell the difference between protecting it and controlling it. Her name was Bonnibel. She was about 800 years old by the time Finn was born. She looked about 13. She had built a kingdom. She had given her brother a safe place to exist. She had made friends and enemies and fallen in love and out of love and in love again. She had watched the world change around her and changed with it in the ways that a centuries-old being changes. She was, in almost every meaningful sense, one of the most important people in the history of the Land of Ooo. And she still had never quite resolved the thing with Gumbald, because eventually the dum-dum juice wore off. Section 5. Marceline. 1,000 years of being the last person in the room. Let us go back to Marceline, standing in the ruins of the post-war world with Hambo under her arm, and her father eating her fries in some demolished diner, thoroughly failing to understand why she was upset. Hunson Abadir, Lord of Evil, ruler of the Nightosphere, father of Marceline, is in certain ways the most helpfully illustrative character in Adventure Time when it comes to the gap between love and attention. Hunson loved Marceline. This is established, eventually, explicitly. He loved her in the way that some parents love their children, which is to say thoroughly in the abstract and somewhat inadequately in the specific. He was present in the Nightosphere, managing the dimension of chaos and demonkind that was his domain, doing whatever it is that Lords of Evil do to maintain a working hell dimension, and the fact that his daughter was alone in a devastated post-apocalyptic landscape with no one to protect her was something that he registered only in the dimmest way. Marceline had her father's demon nature. She was not fully human to begin with. Her mother, Elise, had been human, but Hunson Abadir's blood carries something else. Something that made Marceline fundamentally different from the human survivors around her. She healed faster than she should. She was stronger. She had instincts that served her in ways that pure humans would not have had in the same situation. But she was still a child, still grieving, still carrying the absence of Simon like a wound that did not close. The relationship with her father deteriorated over the fries. This sounds trivial. It is not trivial. Marceline had worked for something, had earned money in whatever form money still existed in the post-war economy, and she had bought herself something to eat, and Hunson had eaten it without asking, without noticing, without understanding that the fries were not just fries. They were one of the few things she had that were entirely hers in a world that had taken everything from her. And he ate them and did not understand why she was upset, and she wrote him a song about it centuries later, because some things do not stop hurting no matter how much time passes. She went out on her own. This is Marceline, a teenager, or whatever the demon hybrid equivalent of a teenager is, in a world full of things that wanted to kill her, going out alone because the alternatives were worse. She roamed. She looked for community, for connection, for something that felt like belonging in a landscape where belonging had mostly ceased to exist. She found Two Bread Tom. Specifically, she found the tribe of human survivors that Two Bread Tom was leading toward the coast, the people who would eventually become the founding population of the human islands. They were afraid of her at first. She was strange, half-demon, not quite human, too fast and too strong, and with eyes that did things eyes should not do. But she was also fierce and capable, and she had spent years navigating a world full of things that wanted to hurt people. And the tribe quickly discovered that having Marceline around meant fewer catastrophic outcomes. Because there were vampires. This is something that Adventure Time introduces in the miniseries Stakes, the story of how Marceline became what she is, and it is one of the richest explorations of character and identity in the show. Vampires had emerged in the post-war world as one of the more dangerous new species. Not numerous, but terrible. Powerful predators who fed on the surviving humans and who represented a significant existential threat to the remnants of human civilization. Marceline began fighting them. She became a vampire hunter. The Stakes miniseries does something remarkable in how it tells this story. It does not simply present Marceline as a hunter who was efficient and effective, as it shows us the emotional landscape of what it was like to do that work, to be the thing standing between the last humans in the world and the predators that wanted to consume them. Marceline was not doing this for glory or recognition. The humans she protected were often afraid of her, sometimes outright hostile, unable or unwilling to fully trust something that was not quite human in a world where not quite human had become genuinely threatening. She protected them anyway. She got nothing from it except the knowledge that she was doing it. This is fundamental to understanding Marceline as a character. Under all the mischief and the rock music and the centuries-old persona of someone who does not care what anyone thinks, Marceline is someone who has consistently, over 1,000 years, put herself between the things that would hurt people and the people those things would hurt. Simon taught her that in the ruins of the old world, carrying her in his arm through devastated cityscapes and putting himself between her and every danger. She learned it from the best possible teacher and then lived it for the rest of her very long life. Not because it was comfortable or rewarding, but because it was simply what she did. Each vampire she killed, she learned, transferred something of their power to her through the act of killing, absorbed through the soul that she took when they died. It worked differently than ordinary killing because of her demon heritage. Marceline accumulated abilities: the power of the Fool, who could fly; the power of the Empress, who could turn invisible; the power of the Moon, who could heal; the power of the Hierophant, who had a kind of invincibility in his monstrous form; and ultimately the power of the Vampire King himself. These 5 vampires were the most powerful among their kind, the apex predators of the post-war nightmare ecology, and Marceline hunted them one by one. The Vampire King was the last. He was ancient and terrible, and in their final confrontation, he bit her. Even as she was killing him, even as she drove the stake through him, he managed to get his teeth into her neck, and the infection took hold. Marceline, who had spent years hunting vampires to protect the last humans in the world, became a vampire herself. The irony is almost cruel enough to be funny. In the Adventure Time way, she became the last vampire. She gained all of their powers at once. She became immortal, in the peculiar vampire sense of the word. Not unkillable, but immune to most things that would end an ordinary life, including time itself. She no longer needed to eat blood to survive. She sustained herself on the color red, on shades of crimson and rose and scarlet that she drained from food and objects, satisfying something in her biology that was vampire enough to need the abstraction of the nutrient without requiring the thing itself. Sunlight became a problem. Mirrors stopped showing her anything. She became the Vampire Queen. Not because she chose it, but because she had killed the Vampire King and taken everything he had been, and the title followed the power. She was the last of her kind, and she was something else entirely, something that had never existed before. She was too human to be a monster, and too monster to be human. She was exactly as alone as she had been before, just immortal now, which means the alone part would be permanent unless she worked at it. She worked at it. Over the centuries, Marceline built a life for herself in the Land of Ooo. She played music. Her bass guitar, made from her family's heirloom battle axe, became her constant companion, the through line of her identity when everything else was in flux. She traveled, lived in different places, accumulated memories, had experiences that layered themselves into a personality that was deeply strange and deeply specific and entirely her own. She had relationships that meant things and ended badly. She once lived in what would become Finn and Jake's tree fort with a boyfriend named Ash, and Ash sold Hambo to a witch, and that was the end of Ash. She met Bonnabelle Bubblegum. When this happened, that is not precisely specified, but it was a long time before the events of the main series, long enough that the relationship had time to bloom into something real and complicated and then fade into something strained and unresolved. Marceline, on tour, threw her shirt from the stage into the crowd. Bubblegum caught it. That is the beginning of it. What followed, the friendship that became more than friendship, and then became something guarded and fraught because Bubblegum was always working, always governing, always putting the Candy Kingdom first in ways that felt like being deprioritized. All of that is told in fragments across the series and the Obsidian special. The shirt that Marceline gave Bubblegum became the most prized possession in Bubblegum's collection, kept carefully for centuries, a physical record of something that had mattered. The fact that Bubblegum never mentioned this to Marceline, never said, I still have this, I've kept it this whole time, is very Princess Bubblegum. Very, I feel enormous things and express none of them, because I am a ruler and rulers do not expose their hearts. Very, the behavior of someone who would rather be misunderstood than be vulnerable. And very, the kind of thing that eventually broke the relationship down when all the unexpressed things became too heavy to carry. By the time of the main series, Marceline was 1,000 years old and looked like a teenager. She was simultaneously one of the most powerful beings in the Land of Ooo and one of the most privately lonely. She had her music, she had her cave house, she had the complex, unresolved thing with Bubblegum and the complex, unresolved thing with her father and the gap in herself that had the shape of Simon Petrikov in it. She could transform into monstrous forms. She could fly. She could become invisible and manipulate the minds of the weak. She was the vampire queen and had been for nearly 1,000 years. She was also still, underneath all of it, the small girl who had been found crying in the rubble by a man who gave her a stuffed toy so she would have something to hold. Section 6. The Lich and the Hero. Billy, evil has always been here. The Lich did not sit idle for the 1,000 years between the Mushroom War and the events of Adventure Time. He was active. He was building power, finding hosts, working toward his singular purpose. He was, and this cannot be overstated, genuinely ancient evil. Not the kind of evil that has grievances or can be reasoned with, or secretly just needs to be understood. He was evil as a cosmic principle, the counterweight to the good that Finn's comet represented. The death drive of the universe given conscious form and will. In his first major recorded appearance in the Land of Oo's recent history, the Lich had already amassed enough power to represent an existential threat to the entire region. And it was a hero named Billy who stopped him. Billy was perhaps the greatest adventurer Oo had ever known in the era just before Finn. He is described in the stories that filter down to Finn through the Grasslands culture as having been essentially superhuman in his heroism. Someone who had fought every major monster, defeated every significant evil, protected the innocence of Ooo from threats that would have destroyed entire kingdoms. He was the model for heroism in Oo's popular imagination, the template against which all adventurers measured themselves. He defeated the Lich. He found the Lich when the ancient evil was at full power, and he fought him, and he kicked the Lich's face into a tower, and he trapped him inside a chunk of amber. A crystalline prison, hardened around the most dangerous being in the Land of Ooo, placed at the top of the candy castle and sealed there as thoroughly as Billy could manage. What Billy's victory cost him is not something the show explores directly, but the show gives us the aftermath of it, which is revealing. By the time Finn discovers him, Billy has retired. Not happily, as not in the way of someone who has completed their work and can rest, but in the way of someone who has realized that fighting evil is Sisyphean, that you defeat one monster and another rises, that the work is never done, that all the battles he won did not stop the world from continuing to produce things that needed fighting. Billy became convinced that heroism was meaningless, that fighting was not the answer, that the individual act of courage changed nothing in the large-scale arrangement of suffering and threat. This is what Finn eventually has to challenge, not by arguing philosophy, but by being Finn. By simply continuing to be someone who helps people because it is right to help people, whether or not it changes the fundamental nature of the universe. Billy's disillusionment is also a setup for his death, because the Lich, patient and cunning, uses Billy's body as a puppet. By the time Finn realizes that the being he thinks is Billy is not Billy, it is too late to save the real man. This is one of Adventure Time's darkest moments, the greatest hero of the previous generation, used by his greatest enemy as a means of manipulating the greatest hero of the current one. The Lich does not simply overpower heroes, he uses them. He uses the trust that heroes inspire, the credibility they have accumulated through years of genuine good work, as a weapon against the people those heroes protected. That is a more sophisticated and devastating form of evil than simple violence, and it is one of the reasons the Lich remains genuinely frightening rather than simply dangerous. What does the Lich actually want? The Lich. This is worth understanding clearly. He wants the extinction of all life. Not just in the Land of Ooo, not just on Earth, in the universe, in every universe. He is, as he eventually reveals, the last scholar of Golb, the cosmic entity that embodies chaos and discord. The Lich's goal is to honor Golb by completing what Golb represents: the end of the ordered world, the dissolution of everything that has been built, the return to the primordial chaos that existed before existence had a shape. This is not madness in the human sense. The Lich does not have a trauma that explains his behavior, or a wound that could be healed, or a misunderstanding that could be corrected. He is operating on the logic of his own nature, fulfilling the purpose that was imprinted in him when the green comet first struck the Earth 65 million years ago. And he is the personification of entropy. He is the universe's death wish wearing a skeleton's body and speaking in a voice that sounds like teeth on metal. He is also deeply, genuinely terrifying in ways that Adventure Time earns fully. The first time we see him in his full, unimprisoned form, he is not comic. He is not the kind of villain who has a relatable motivation or a moment of humanizing doubt. He looks at the world, and he sees material that should not exist, life that should have ended, an error in the cosmic ledger that needs to be corrected. His voice could strip paint. His fire is green and cold and wrong in ways that biological fire is not. He is what happens when the universe decides it does not want any more of this. The Lich moved against Prismo. He moved against the multiverse. He eventually found his way to the Time Room, where he demanded that the Wishmaster grant him a wish for the extinction of all life. 5 words that threatened every timeline simultaneously. This is the moment that opens the episode Finn the Human, and it is the moment that demonstrates how Adventure Time thinks about evil. The Lich is not wrong exactly in the cosmic logic of his nature. He is the death drive. He is a real force. The only thing that ever stops him is the equal and opposite force represented by Finn, and even that opposition is less a victory than a constant, ongoing, exhausting maintenance of the argument that life is worth continuing. Finn's counterwish created Farm World, an alternate timeline where the mushroom bomb never went off, where Simon sacrificed himself to stop it using the Crown's ice powers, but where humanity had survived in a fragile continuation, and the Lich had never been born. But Farm World is not a paradise. Without the Lich's bomb as its catalyst, the world did not develop magic in the same way. And more importantly, evil did not cease to exist just because the Lich was never born. In Farm World, the potential for everything that happened is still present in the world, still waiting in other forms, still looking for expression. You cannot wish evil out of existence. You can only oppose it, encounter after encounter, for as long as it takes. The Lich was eventually turned into something unexpected, a baby. Finn, during the events of Escape from the Citadel, used the regenerative blood of one of the Citadel Guardians, blood that healed anything it touched in the most literal possible way, and splashed it on the Lich. And the Lich, stripped of the dark flesh that had sustained his form, was reduced to something essential and small. A huge humanoid baby with a dumb smile on his face sitting in the rubble, no memory of having been the destroyer of worlds. Tree Trunks and Mr. Pig found him. They named him Sweet Pea. They took him home. Sweet Pea is one of Adventure Time's gentlest jokes and also one of its deepest philosophical statements. The universe's destroyer of life, reformed into a child who goes to school and has friends and nightmares about being a skeleton. The Lich still exists within Sweet Pea, dormant but not dead, capable of surfacing in moments of extreme emotional stress. But Sweet Pea is also real, also a genuine new person, also something that has its own value independent of what it used to be. The question of whether Sweet Pea is the Lich or whether the Lich is Sweet Pea, whether transformation this profound constitutes a kind of death or a kind of rebirth, is the kind of question Adventure Time poses and leaves you to answer for yourself. Section 7. Finn the Human, the last human who was not the last human. Finn Mertens was born on Hub Island. This sentence contains more information than it appears to, because for most of the series run, both Finn and the audience believe him to be the last human being in the Land of Ooo. The revelation that there are other humans, that they have been living on a chain of islands out in the sea for 1,000 years, carefully isolated from the mainland by a system of guardians and protocols designed to keep them safe, restructures the meaning of Finn's entire existence retroactively. But let us begin at the beginning. Hub Island was one of the islands settled by the human survivors who fled the mainland after the Mushroom War. Led, eventually, by a succession of descendants of those original refugees, the island community developed its own culture over the centuries. It was careful. It was protective. It had an entire social infrastructure built around keeping its people safe, including a class of beings called Seekers, who enforced the island's policies about leaving, and Helpers, who were essentially the island's medical and support workers. Finn's mother, Minerva Campbell, was a helper. His father, Martin Mertens, was a con artist who had recently moved from being a con artist to being a barber, motivated in large part by meeting Minerva and finding, somewhat to his own surprise, that he wanted to be the kind of person she could respect. Martin Mertens in his youth was not a good man in the conventional sense. He was charming and quick and entirely self-serving, the kind of person who moved through the world taking what was useful and discarding what was not, and not feeling particularly bad about it. He had made enemies. On the island, where community and trust were not abstract ideals but survival necessities, this mattered more than it might in a larger society. His past had given him people who would eventually come looking for him. One night while Minerva was at work at the hospital, those people came. Martin was alone in the house with infant Finn. And Martin, faced with people who wanted to hurt him and a baby who could not protect himself, did the thing that defined the rest of his life. He ran. But he grabbed Finn. He ran for the beach, he got onto a raft, he tried to signal Minerva and then the Guardian, a giant, ancient mechanical construct that circled the island to prevent unauthorized departures, found them. The confrontation with the Guardian resulted in Martin and Finn being separated, and in Martin receiving a head injury severe enough to cause lasting personality changes that may account for much of who he was, when Finn eventually found him again. Infant Finn was cast adrift on the ocean alone, floating in a tiny raft toward the mainland. The Land of Ooo received him. He was found in the woods by Joshua and Margaret, two anthropomorphic dogs who were already parents to a young dog named Germain. They found him helpless on a large leaf. Finn had, as he would later describe it in the adorable vocabulary of a very small child, done boom boom on the leaf and fallen over and could not get up, and was crying. Joshua and Margaret brought him home. They raised him as their own son. He grew up in the world of talking animals and candy people and wizard trees as though it were perfectly ordinary, which for him it was, because it was the only world he had ever known. Finn grew up wanting to be a hero. This is not unusual in itself. Many children want to be heroes, and most of them grow out of it when they discover that heroism requires getting hurt and being afraid. Finn grew into it. His commitment to helping people, to fighting evil, to putting himself between the things that wanted to hurt people and the people those things wanted to hurt, never wavered. It deepened with experience. It became more nuanced and complicated as he got older, but the core of it, the simple, direct conviction that people needed protecting, and that if you were capable of providing that protection you should, never changed. What makes Finn exceptional as a protagonist, beyond the swords and the dungeons and the impossible bravery, is his emotional honesty. He does not hide what he is feeling. He gets crushes on Princess Bubblegum and is obvious about it, gets his feelings hurt when she does not reciprocate in the way he hoped, falls in love with Flame Princess with the total vulnerability of someone who has not learned to protect himself from emotional risk yet. He grieves loudly when he grieves. He is scared sometimes in ways he does not try to conceal. The combination of genuine physical courage and emotional openness makes him unusual in the landscape of animated protagonists, and it is what allows the show to use him as a vessel for exploring emotional truths that a more guarded character could not access. His relationship with Flame Princess is worth dwelling on. She was the Fire Kingdom's princess, locked away from the world by her own father, who feared what she might become if she were allowed to connect with other people. Finn fell for her partly because of who she was, and partly because of what she represented. Someone who had been told they were too dangerous to love, and who needed to find out whether that was true. Their relationship was the first time Finn experienced something like reciprocal romantic feeling, and it was also the first time he learned that loving someone well means not trying to protect them from themselves, not trying to contain what they are out of your own need for safety. He failed at this more than once, and the relationship eventually ended because of it. But the way he processed that failure, the way he sat with the grief of it without trying to skip over it, was part of what made him who he was by the end. The Grass Sword episode arc is another crucial piece of Finn's development. He found a magical grass sword that merged with his right arm, giving him a powerful weapon but taking something away from him in the process. A dependency, a loss of choice, the sword making decisions for him in moments when its nature overrode his own. This would eventually result in the grass entity within the sword becoming its own person. A grass-covered duplicate of Finn named Fern, who had all of Finn's memories, but a different relationship to what those memories meant. Fern's existence, and his death, said something specific about identity and authenticity that Finn had to sit with. What makes you you if someone else has all your memories? What do you owe the version of yourself that split off and became its own being? These are not questions with clean answers, and Adventure Time does not pretend they are. Jake the dog was his brother, adoptive and magical. Jake had the ability to stretch and transform his body into any shape, the result of his father Joshua being infected by a shape-shifting alien entity named Warren Ampersand, who had impregnated Joshua as a way of passing on his stretchy powers to a compatible host. Jake did not know about Warren Ampersand for most of his life, and when he found out, it was complicated in ways that echo some of Finn's own complexity about Martin. Finn and Jake lived in the tree fort in the grasslands. They had adventures. They saved princesses and fought monsters and explored dungeons and discovered the layered mysteries of the world they lived in. They were, in the way of genuine best friends, better together than either was alone, and the show spent 10 seasons proving it. Finn's development as a character across those seasons is one of the most genuine coming-of-age arcs in animation. He started as an eager, a somewhat reckless boy who measured everything in terms of heroic and unheroic, and did not yet have the emotional vocabulary to navigate anything more subtle than adventure. He grew into someone who understood that heroism was more complicated, that helping people sometimes meant not fighting, that the people you love will disappoint you and you will disappoint them, and that is survivable, that your identity is not defined by any single thing about you, not your species, not your parents, not your destiny as a comet reincarnated. Finding out about Martin was one of the major turning points. Finn had spent years wondering about his biological father, had constructed in his imagination a version of Martin that made the abandonment bearable. An adventurer, maybe, someone who had to leave for reasons that were important and good. The reality, when Finn eventually found Martin in the Crystal Citadel where he was imprisoned for cosmic crimes that were never fully specified, was not that. Martin was charming and slippery and fundamentally unable to prioritize anyone's needs over his own, including his son's. He did not even have a good reason for abandoning Finn. He said simply that he did not remember. And then, as Finn tried to stop him from leaving again, Martin escaped, and in the process, Finn's right arm was torn off. Adventure Time is a show about loss. Not obviously. On the surface, it is a show about a boy and his magical dog having adventures, but underneath, consistently, it is about the specific kind of loss that does not have a satisfying narrative resolution. The loss of Simon to the crown's curse, the loss of Marceline's mother to radiation, and the loss of the old world to the bombs. Finn losing his arm to a father who could not stay, and then, in one of the show's more extraordinary narrative moves, growing a new arm from a sentient grass entity that merged with the bone that remained, and then losing that arm too in a different way, and eventually having a robotic arm by the series finale. The arm becomes a kind of symbol for all of it, the ways the world takes things from you, the ways you rebuild, the imperfect forms that the rebuilt things take. He found his mother. This was better. The Islands miniseries is one of the finest extended pieces of storytelling in Adventure Time's run. Finn, Jake, Susan Strong, and BMO set out in a boat to find the human islands that Susan's emergence from underwater and subsequent clues pointed toward. They found Hub Island. They found a world that had chosen safety over aliveness in a very specific way. Minerva, confronted with a virus that had nearly ended the remaining human population, had uploaded her consciousness to a network of robots to manage the island's care infrastructure from every terminal simultaneously. Her physical body was preserved. Her mind existed everywhere and was reachable through any screen on the island. She had essentially become a distributed being in order to protect her people. and she had protected them successfully for decades. She had also, in protecting them so completely, contributed to a culture that had become so focused on safety that it had stopped being able to imagine anything beyond the island's borders. When Finn arrived and talked about the mainland, about Ooo, about adventures and friends, and the full strange world he had grown up in, the islanders heard it as dangerous, as the kind of thing that needed to be discouraged. Minerva tried to trap Finn on the island, not maliciously, but out of the same overwhelming protective impulse that had defined her for years. Finn convinced her to let him go. He told her about who he was, what his life had been, how the things she was trying to protect him from were also the things that had made him himself. And she listened, and she let him go, and the separation cost them both something real. He invited the humans to come back to Ooo. Most of them said not yet. Some said maybe someday. The meeting was bittersweet and incomplete in the way that reunion after long separation tends to be when the people involved have become different people while apart. This Section 8. The Ice King's Long Winter. 1,000 years of not remembering. Let us return to Simon. Let us look at what happened to him over the 1,000 years between the end of the Mushroom War and the moment Finn and Jake encountered him in his ice tower, loudly insisting that a princess marry him. The Ice King is, from a certain angle, a comedic figure. He is a short blue man with an enormous nose and an enormous beard, who flies around using the power of his beard's movement, who kidnaps princesses and insists on his own romantic appeal in the face of consistent evidence to the contrary. He makes ice sculptures of his penguin Gunter. He writes fan fiction about gender-swapped versions of Finn and Jake having adventures with a character called Fiona and a cat called Cake. He has a room full of wedding planning materials. He wants someone to love him, desperately and openly, in a way that is somehow both pathetic and pure. He is also the tragedy of a brilliant, loving man whose identity was replaced piece by piece by the accumulated weight of a magical curse he could never escape. Simon Petrikov did not choose to become the Ice King. Simon Petrikov fought the transformation for years, documented it, warned people about it, and then lost the fight as he always was going to lose it, because the crown's magic was not the kind of thing that can be defeated through will alone. When Finn and Jake began to understand this, when they watched the VHS tapes, when they saw the letters Simon had left for Marceline, when they pieced together the history, their relationship with the Ice King changed. It had to. But you cannot know the full truth of something and continue seeing only the surface. There is a specific quality to the Ice King's loneliness that separates it from ordinary cartoon villain loneliness. He is not lonely because he is bad. He is lonely because something has been done to him, a wound so deep and so old that he has forgotten it is a wound, that he mistakes the scar tissue for his original face. He knows that he wants a princess. He does not know why. He knows that having a princess would fix something, would fill some gap that gapes in him whenever he is quiet long enough to notice it. He does not know that the gap has a name, and the name is Betty, and the shape of it matches exactly the shape of a woman who left a burning city and leaped through a portal and is living somewhere in this same world, also looking for him. But the Ice King's relationship with Finn and Jake evolved over the series in ways that are quietly beautiful. They started as adversaries, the Ice King kidnapping Princess Bubblegum, Finn and Jake rescuing her over and over in the endless loop of a cartoon premise that eventually revealed itself to be about something real. But as the Ice King's backstory was revealed, as the tragedy of Simon Petrikov became visible through the clownish surface, Finn and Jake's antagonism shifted into something that included genuine compassion. They could not fix him. There was nothing to fix him with, short of divine intervention or the inside of Golb's stomach. But they could treat him as a person, acknowledge his history, refuse to reduce him to his worst moments, and that meant something even when they could not give him what he actually needed. But he tried to be their friend. This is one of the Ice King's most consistent behavioral patterns throughout the series. An ongoing, awkward, mostly unsuccessful campaign to be close to people who have every reason to keep him at a distance. He shows up at the tree fort. He offers gifts that are not quite right. He interrupts things. He misreads social cues in ways that make the people around him uncomfortable. And underneath all of it, visible if you are paying attention, is the echo of Simon Petrikov's gift for friendship and warmth, still present in whatever the crown has left of him, reaching toward connection the way a plant will turn toward any available light. 1,000 years alone, mostly. The Ice Kingdom was his domain, and the cold mountains where the ambient magic of the world responded to his ice powers and built itself into a geography that matched his interior state. Frozen and sharp and silent, occasionally beautiful in the austere way that empty places are beautiful, but fundamentally inhospitable to the things that warm-blooded beings need to survive and flourish. He had his penguins. He had Gunter, the compressed cosmic warlord, who waddled around being inexplicably, persistently mischievous in small ways. He had his wedding magazines and his fan fiction and his ice sculptures, and the obsession with princesses that he could not explain even to himself. The obsession with princesses was the crown's shadow memory of Betty. He had called her my princess. The crown, in transforming him into its distorted version of Evergreen, had kept this fragment intact, the way a glacier sometimes preserves a flower from a summer-long past. Perfectly shaped, with no context remaining. He knew he needed a princess. He did not know that what he was reaching for was a specific person, a woman with auburn hair who wore glasses and who had loved him, and who, in a twist of temporal logic that Adventure Time eventually reveals, was already alive in the future he was living in. Betty Groff, when Simon first put on the crown, and the crown made him do something terrible and she fled, had been hiding nearby. When Simon, already partly the Ice King, already acting against his own will and better judgment, tried to apologize to her and accidentally opened a portal to the present, she did the thing that would define the rest of her existence. She leaped through the portal. She traveled forward in time to be with Simon, to save him, to find a way to undo what the crown had done. What she found when she arrived was not what she expected. The Simon she knew was essentially gone. What she found was the Ice King, who did not recognize her, who had been the Ice King for centuries, who looked at her with the confused blankness of someone who knows. A face means something to them but cannot access the part of their mind where the meaning lives. Betty, who had spent her own time becoming a wizard by other means, who had sacrificed her own sanity and saneness to Magic Man's hat in pursuit of a cure, who had allowed herself to be consumed by her mission to save Simon, stood before the person she had come to save and discovered that saving him was far more complicated than she had imagined. Throughout the series, the Ice King's moments of lucidity are small and bright and devastating. In Betty, when a spell temporarily strips away his ice powers and his mind clears, Simon looks around with the bewildered eyes of someone coming up from deep water. He sees where he is. He understands what has happened. He calls for Betty, not knowing she is literally standing there, not knowing she traveled through time and gave up everything for him. When she appears, she is not who he expects because, in his cleared mind, he is expecting the Betty from his own time. The Betty before everything, and the Betty in front of him has lived through things he cannot imagine. The reunion is not the neat conclusion either of them needed. It is a beginning of something new that is also a continuation of something very old. The Ice King was, as one critic would eventually say, the best character in Adventure Time. Not the most powerful, not the most heroic, not the most complex in terms of plot involvement, but the most human. Because his story is the story of what happens when something essential in a person is slowly replaced by something that serves another purpose, and whether what remains is still the person, and whether the person who used to exist still has claims on the body and life that kept going in their absence. Section 9. Betty, Golby, and the Finale. The Chaos at the End of Everything. The Adventure Time finale is called Come Along With Me. It is structurally an epilogue told by BMO, who is 1,000 years in the future, the King of Ooo, to two young adventurers named Shermie and Beth, who want to know about the old heroes. And it is, simultaneously, the conclusion of every major storyline the show had been developing for 10 seasons. The Gum War, Betty and Simon, the Lich, Golb, the nature of chaos, the power of music, what love actually costs. The Great Gum War came first. Gumbald had returned. The dum-dum juice eventually wore off, as it had always been going to wear off, and the creature that remembered being Bonnibel's scheming uncle re-emerged. He gathered forces. He declared war on the Candy Kingdom. He had been building Gumbaldia in the shadows of the show's mythology for years, the candy city he had always wanted, and now he was going to use it against the woman who had unmade him. Princess Bubblegum prepared for war. Finn and Jake tried to prevent it. The moral weight of the conflict was distributed in uncomfortable ways. Gumbald had a legitimate grievance. In that he had been chemically lobotomized against his will, and Bubblegum had done that to him deliberately. She was not simply a victim. She was also someone who had spent 800 years as a benevolent but fundamentally authoritarian ruler, and the crack in her legitimacy that Gumbald represented was real. The show did not let her off easy. What prevented the war, temporarily, was Finn and Jake's intervention in a shared dream space, a place where Jake's nightmare juice could create a confrontation with internal realities rather than external ones, where the motivations behind the conflict could be exposed and examined. In that space, the war came to the edge of a genuine resolution, a genuine reckoning, a moment where both sides might have chosen differently. And then Golb arrived. Golb is not the Lich. And it is important to understand this distinction. The Lich is a sentient being with a goal. He wants extinction, and he pursues it with intelligence and patience and will. Golb is not like that. Golb does not have goals in any meaningful sense. Golb is chaos. Golb is disorder itself. The universal force that opposes not evil or good specifically, but order in general, structure in general, the human desire to make things mean things and persist through time. Golb destroys because that is what Golb is, not because Golb chooses to. He is enormous. When he appeared above the battlefield where the Candy Kingdom's forces and Gumbald's Candy Army faced each other, he blocked the sky. He was red and pyramidal at the crown, and he had eyes that looked at the world with a total absence of malice, which was somehow more frightening than malice would have been. Malice is comprehensible. Malice can be argued with, negotiated with, tricked. Golb's blankness was the blankness of a force of nature, a hurricane that does not know it is destroying anything, a flood that does not understand what a house is. He was discord made tangible, walking through a world built on order and taking it apart because that is the only thing discord knows how to do. The creatures he spawned from the mass of candy people he transformed were terrible in the same blank way. They were not soldiers. They were expressions of chaos, embodiments of the disruption Golby carried within himself, seeking not to win a battle but simply to unmake whatever they touched. Princess Bubblegum discovered the key. She had always been a scientist. And even in crisis, she was thinking like one, turning the problem over, looking at the data. GOLB is discord. If GOLB is discord, then what opposes GOLB is not violence, but its opposite, harmony, order. Not the rigid authoritarian order that Bubblegum had sometimes confused for good governance, but genuine harmony, the kind that arises when beings choose to be in accord with each other voluntarily. She said it out loud. Golb is discord. And if that was true, then the thing that could push back against him was not a weapon, but a song. BMO, battered and half destroyed by the chaos of the battle, began to sing. The small robot who had been Finn and Jake's video game console and household companion, who had survived everything, who had stored within its circuits countless songs and games and movies and memories, found a tune and started it. And the people of Ooo joined in. Not because anyone commanded them to, because it was something to do together in the face of something that wanted them apart. The music did not kill Golb's creatures, but it pushed them back. It created a space where Golb's influence had less purchase, where the harmony of beings in agreement could exist alongside the chaos that Golb embodied. He arrived because Betty summoned him. Betty, in her wizard madness, in her desperate pursuit of anything that might save Simon from the crown's curse, had identified Golb as a force that might, if properly redirected, have the power to sever the connection between Simon and the crown. Her plan was reckless and based on incomplete understanding and absolutely characteristic of someone who had been compromised by Magic Man's hat for years. Normal Man helped her. Maja the Sky Witch provided the power, and Golb descended on the Land of Ooo like something from before the world existed, vast and red and terrible, with enormous eyes and a mouth that opened onto something that was not quite an interior and was not quite a dimension. He swallowed people. This is what Golb does. He swallows, and his digestive process resets things to their essential state. Inside GOLB, the accumulated changes of time and experience and transformation are stripped away layer by layer until what remains is the original, the primal, the thing a person or object was before anything happened to them. For the Ice King and his crown, this was the key to everything. Inside Golb, the crown's corruption was reversed. The layers of Urgent's Evergreen's imprint, everything that had been warped by Gunther's original misfired wish, were stripped away. The crown became what it had originally been designed to be, a wish-granting artifact with no additional curse built in. And the Ice King became what he had been before the crown ever touched him. Simon Petrikov, in his own body, with his own mind, with his glasses and his dark hair and his original self intact. Betty was there too, her magic stripped away by the same process. She and Simon found each other inside GOLB. Both returned to themselves, both seeing each other clearly for the first time in 1,000 years. Simon was here. Betty was here. They had both lived through an extraordinary amount to reach this moment. And then Finn came crashing through an opening, and Betty understood that the opening would not last. And she made a choice. She could leave with Simon, or she could use the crown. Now in its wish-granting state, to do something about Golb, but she could not do both. Betty had always been, at her core, someone whose love for Simon was the organizing principle of her entire existence. But love at the level Betty operated at is not always sweet. Sometimes it is the willingness to become something terrible so the person you love does not have to. She pushed Simon and Finn through the opening. She stayed behind. She took the crown and tried to wish Golb away, tried to banish him from the world. Golb was too powerful for that. The wish had no effect on him directly, so she wished for something else. She wished for the power to protect Simon, and the wish, granted by the crown in its essential and literal wish-granting form, did the only thing it could do with a request like that. It gave her the power of Golb himself. As it merged them, Betty Groff and Golby became one entity, a new being that carried Betty's consciousness inside the universe's chaos deity, and that new being, Golb Betty, looked at the Land of Ooo and understood that it was time to leave. Golb Betty ascended through a portal in the sky. The Land of Ooo was safe. Simon was free. The crown was gone in its corrupted form, lying on the ground in its essential state, and Gunther, the penguin, found it. And what was Gunther's deepest wish, the ancient wish that had been waiting in his compressed, cosmic core since the age of the dinosaurs when he had been Orgolorg, and before that something even stranger? He wished to be like Ice King. He wished for a drum set. The crown merged with him and he became the Ice Thing, a new version of something familiar, inheriting the Ice Kingdom, and eventually marrying Turtle Princess and living what appeared to be, by every available metric, a genuinely happy life. Simon Petrikov wept. He was free. He was alive. He was himself. And the person who had made that possible was gone, merged with a cosmic chaos entity, and the Simon who existed now was the one who had always existed underneath the curse, but had not been reachable for 1,000 years. He stood in the ruins of the battle with everything he had wanted for a century and the profound, irreducible grief of understanding what it had cost. He would eventually find his way forward, not quickly and not easily. The Fiona and Cake spin-off series, set years after the finale, shows Simon struggling with depression in the aftermath of his restoration. The crown had been terrible, but it had also been his companion for 1,000 years. And freedom from a 1,000-year prison is not the same as immediately knowing how to be free. He searched for Betty in whatever form she now existed. He found Golb Betty eventually, and what he found was that Betty, or the consciousness within Golb Betty, was not suffering. She had made her choice with full understanding of what it meant. What she had done was not a tragedy to her. It was the ultimate expression of the love she had always carried. Simon had to learn to let that be enough, and to build a life that did not depend on getting her back. And that is its own kind of courage, the courage of accepting a love that you cannot repay, that you can only carry forward and try to deserve. Section 10. The World After. What everything was for, Finn and Jake survived the finale. Not of course they did, but let us sit with what they had been through to get there. Finn had grown from an eager, reckless boy who measured everything in fight or not fight terms into a young man who had lost an arm, found and accepted his father's limitations, traveled to space, faced his cosmic nature as a reincarnated comet, helped his mother find peace with letting him go, and done his part in averting what would have been the most catastrophic war in the Land of Oo's recent history. Jake had been with him for all of it, stretchy and ridiculous and genuinely wise in the way that people who never worry about being taken seriously sometimes are. Jake's wisdom is its own kind of gift. He is, on the surface, the lazier half of the partnership, the one who would rather eat a sandwich than fight a monster, and who approaches life with a pragmatism that looks like irresponsibility, but is actually something more considered. He has lived in the world long enough, and been shaped by a magical nature that connects him to something older and stranger than ordinary dogs, to understand that most things are survivable, that the moments that feel unbearable usually are not actually unbearable, that maintaining your equilibrium in the middle of a crisis is not cowardice but craft. He loves Finn with the completeness of someone who has chosen their person and intends to keep choosing them. His occasional absences and self-absorbedness are real character flaws, and the show is honest about them, but they do not diminish the fundamental truth of his devotion. By the series finale, Finn and Jake were no longer children, but they had lived through enough to qualify as veterans of something larger than ordinary adolescence, and the lightness that remained in them, the willingness to run toward adventure, the ability to find joy in the things that Ooo offered, was not innocence but a kind of hard-won optimism, the quality of people who have seen enough difficulty to know that difficulty is not the whole story. In the finale's epilogue sequence, we are shown glimpses of what became of everyone. Marceline and Bubblegum, finally, after everything, together on a couch under a blanket. Just together. The version of them that had existed before Bubblegum became too consumed by governance, before the distance and the pride and the unspoken things accumulated into years of silence, had found its way back. It did not require a grand declaration or a dramatic scene, and it required apparently surviving Golby together and one of them almost dying and the other not being willing to pretend that was fine. They kissed in the series finale in the first unambiguous physical expression of something the show had been building toward since the very beginning. Adventure Time gave them their ending without fanfare. Just warmth, just two people who had carried something between them for centuries finally setting it down together. Their story, when you trace it from beginning to end, is one of the most patient love stories ever put into a children's cartoon. Not patient in the sense of chaste or uncomplicated. It was messy and interrupted and full of long silences where things should have been said. Bubblegum carrying Marceline's shirt for hundreds of years without ever telling her. At Marceline writing songs that were really conversations she was too proud to have out loud. Both of them in the same world, choosing different things, until the world gave them a situation too large to hide from. The finale does not redeem their history or explain away its difficulties. It simply adds to it, one more layer on top of all the others, the layer that says, and in the end, they were together. After everything, together. Simon moved in with them. This is one of the details that feels genuinely, quietly beautiful. Simon Petrikov, former Ice King, the man who had been Marceline's father figure in the ruins of the old world and had then forgotten her for 1,000 years, was now living in the same house as the daughter he had not remembered and the girlfriend she had finally reconciled with. They were something like a family in the strange, cobbled-together way that chosen families form in Adventure Time's universe. Not the family anyone would have designed. The family that the weight of 1,000 years had produced. Now, the distant future. 1,000 years after the events of the series finale, the Land of Ooo has changed in the ways that 1,000 years will change anything. The Candy Kingdom is gone from its original location, its ruins overgrown, its people scattered or transformed by the passage of time. A mountain dominates the landscape in a new configuration, and at the top of that mountain sits BMO. The small robot who had been Finn and Jake's video game console and household companion had outlasted everyone. Of course, BMO had outlasted everyone. BMO was the cockroach of Adventure Time. Unkillable not through toughness, but through the simple fact that small, electronic, non-biological things persist in ways that organic beings cannot. BMO had become the king of Ooo. Not by conquest or ambition, but simply by having been there so long that the new civilization that had grown up around the mountain had come to understand BMO as foundational to the landscape. BMO had memories of the old heroes. BMO had stories. When Shermie and Beth, two young adventurers, climbed the mountain to ask the King of Ooo about the legendary Finn and Jake, BMO was there to tell them everything. BMO's position as king is Adventure Time's final argument about what endures. Not power, not strength, not even heroism in the conventional sense. The robot who survived, the one who became the repository of memory and story, the one who made the past accessible to the future, was the household companion, the one who played video games with the heroes and made breakfast and watched over the tree fort and said good morning. BMO endured because BMO was loved, and was loving and stored everything and never forgot. In a show about the weight of memory and the consequences of history, the being who remembered was the one who mattered most in the long run. Shermie was a boy who reminded viewers of young Finn. Curious, brave, perhaps a little reckless, reaching for heroism with both hands. Beth was a dog with stretchy powers, a descendant of Jake and Lady Rainicorn's pups, carrying in her DNA the stretchy magic that Warren Ampersand had passed to Joshua all those years ago. Together, they were the new iteration of the old partnership, Finn and Jake in new forms. That the eternal adventuring duo that the world seemed to require in every generation. They pulled a sword from Fern's tree. The tree that had grown from Fern's death was now ancient, massive, standing in the landscape as a landmark. The sword within it was waiting for someone to be ready to carry it. The act of pulling it out echoed the act that began everything. The boy who reached for something to fight with and found it and began. Adventure Time ends where it began, in a sense, but with the full weight of everything that happened in between, giving the ending a depth that the beginning could not have had. What does it mean that the show ends here with these two new people who carry echoes of the people we knew? It means that Adventure Time's deepest conviction about the world is that it continues. The specific people change. It's on the love and the loss, and the growth and the friendship. The specific architecture of Finn and Jake's partnership, of Simon and Marceline's bond, of Bubblegum and Marceline's long, complicated love, those specific configurations end. They have to. That is what mortality means, and while some of these characters are immortal in various technical senses, the particular versions of themselves that existed in these relationships could not last forever. But the pattern continues. Someone is always finding a sword. Someone is always being adopted by the person who finds them alone in the woods. Someone is always learning to be brave. Someone is always choosing to stay with their friend rather than run. The heroes are not eternal, but heroism is. The love stories end, but love does not. The Candy Kingdom falls, but somewhere. Something new is being built over the top of the ruins of the old world by someone who wants more family than they currently have. And that is the cycle. Catastrophe. Survival. Building. Living. Losing. Rebuilding. The shape of it is the same across all of Adventure Time's history, from Urgent's Evergreen trying to save the world in the Cretaceous, to Bonobo building the Candy Kingdom in the post-war rubble, to Finn, pulling a sword from a stone in the grasslands of a world that was still recovering from everything. The specific characters are different each time. The fundamental question is the same, given everything that has happened, given the weight of the history and the reality of the loss, and the fact that nothing you build will last forever. Is it still worth trying? Is it still worth building? Is it still worth loving people when you know that loving people includes losing them? Adventure Time answers yes. Not naively. Not by pretending the losses are not real or the failures do not happen. But with full acknowledgement of all of it, yeah. Yes, it is worth it. Yes, the Candy Mountains are worth having even if they will one day be ruins. Yes, the friendship is worth having even if it ends. Yes, the love is worth it even when it costs everything. Yes. Always yes. That is the whole argument of Adventure Time, offered gently, without insistence, buried under candy-colored absurdism and magical logic, and a boy in a white hat who just wants to help. You can take it or leave it, but it is there in every episode, in the deep history of Ooo, in the ancient tragedy of the crown, and the ancient love of the man who wore it. In the thousand-year friendship between a vampire queen and an immortal candy scientist, in the small, bright fact that Finn and Jake lived in a tree fort and had each other and thought that was enough. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. A final word on what it all means. Adventure Time is a show that asks you to hold two true things simultaneously. The first, the world is very old, and terrible things have happened in it, and terrible things will continue to happen. The Mushroom War was real. The Lich was real. The loss of Simon's mind was real. The 1,000 years of loneliness that various people experienced in various forms were real. The world that Finn and Jake adventured through was built on catastrophe, and the memory of that catastrophe was not gone, just buried, just there in the background of every moment of apparent brightness. The second true thing, it was worth it anyway, not in a cheap, pat, everything happens for a reason way. In the harder, more honest way that acknowledges the cost and refuses to let the cost be the final word. Simon Petrikov got himself back. Marceline found her way to Princess Bubblegum. Finn grew into someone who understood the world more fully than he did when we first met him. The Land of Ooo, for all its post-apocalyptic origins, for all the ancient evil buried in its geology and the scars of the war written into its geography, was also genuinely beautiful. The Candy Mountains and the magical creatures and the adventures and the friendships were also real. The world being terrible does not mean the world cannot also be wonderful. Both things are true at once. Adventure Time also says something about time itself. The past is always present. The crown that Urgent's evergreen made in the Cretaceous is still affecting the world 1,000 years after the Mushroom War. The wish that Gunther made in the Age of Dinosaurs is still warping the lives of the people who pick up the crown in what they think is the present. Simon's love for Betty, Betty's love for Simon, exists across centuries and timelines and dimensions. The fries that Hunson ate are still informing who Marceline is. Nothing is ever simply over. The threads run forward and backward through time and touch everything. And perhaps the most important thing Adventure Time says is this: the people who are still here matter more than the cataclysm that brought them here. The Mushroom War destroyed the old world. From the wreckage, an extraordinary variety of beings built something new, something that nobody would have designed from scratch, but which contained real beauty and real community and real meaning. Simon Petrikov was crushed by a magical artifact from the Age of Dinosaurs and still found a way to be kind to a small girl in the ruins. Marceline survived the loss of every person who had ever anchored her and still found music in the wreckage. Bonnibel Bubblegum grew up from gum in the rubble of a bombed-out city and built a kingdom that, for all its flaws, was full of people who had somewhere to belong. The world ended. People kept living, and in the living, things happened that were worth having happened. That is the whole argument of Adventure Time, offered gently, without insistence. Buried under candy-colored absurdism and magical logic, and a boy in a white hat who just wants to help. You can take it or leave it. But it is there in every episode, in the deep history of Ooo, in the ancient tragedy of the crown, and the ancient love of the man who wore it, in the 1,000-year friendship between a vampire queen and an immortal candy scientist, in the small, bright fact that Finn and Jake lived in a tree fort and had each other, and thought that was enough. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. A note on what we did not cover. There is a great deal of Adventure Time lore we have not touched tonight. The story of Prismo, the Wishmaster at the center of time, whose cosmic power rests on the fragile fact that he is the dream of an old man sleeping somewhere in reality. The complete history of the Nightosphere and the nature of Hunson Abadir's relationship with the demonic bureaucracy he rules. The saga of Magic Man and Margles, the love story that became Golb's most personal act of destruction. The Elementals miniseries and what happened when the 4 elemental forces were briefly unconstrained and nearly transformed every living thing in Ooo into their elemental nature. The human islands in full detail, the seekers and the helpers and the generations of people who chose safety over aliveness and what that choice cost them over centuries. The full history of Lemongrab, perhaps the most genuinely pitiable character in the show, a being who was created wrong and suffered because of it, and who Adventure Time treated with more compassion than most shows would extend to a tragedy of that specific flavor. BMO's own deep history, including the origin story of the MO factory and the being who built it, and what that means for BMO's understanding of family and purpose. These are all stories for another night. Adventure Time is one of those properties where the more you look, the more there is to find, where the background details of one episode become the foreground of another, where the mythology is deep enough that you can spend years inside it and still be discovering new chambers. That depth is part of what makes it worth returning to, worth sitting with in the dark, worth letting wash over you when the world outside is too loud, and you need somewhere quiet that also happens to contain 1,000 years of history and a cast of characters who all, in their various broken and beautiful ways, figured out how to keep going. And that is the full sweep of Adventure Time's lore. From the Cretaceous period to the distant future, from the first misfire of an ancient crown to the last notes of a song sung against a chaos god, from the first human who picked up a sword and called herself a hero to the two new adventurers who found the same sword in a tree and understood what it meant to carry it forward. We covered the Mushroom War and its aftermath, Simon and Marceline in the ruins, Bonnibel building the Candy Kingdom on top of nuclear waste and stubbornness, the Lich's cosmic origins, and his long campaign against everything alive. Finn's journey from the last human to a young man who understood what humanity actually meant, and in the finale that wrapped it all in sacrifice and harmony, and the deeply Adventure Time conclusion that sometimes the way to fight chaos is to sing together. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. If you fell asleep somewhere around the Cretaceous and woke up at GOLB, that is completely acceptable. This was always designed to be listened to in the dark, in the comfortable space between awake and dreaming, where stories like this do their best work. If you want more, hit that subscribe button, tap the like if this carried you through the night, and drop a comment telling me which part of the Adventure Time lore you want explored in more depth. There is more to cover. There's always more to cover in a show that built this much history into the background of what appeared to be a cartoon about a boy and his dog. Thank you for watching. Take care of each other. And remember, somewhere at the center of time, there is a wishmaster who keeps his pickles fresh just in case a friend comes by. Keep your own version of those pickles ready. You never know when someone needs them. Good night.